Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. We don't have a whole lot to go through tonight, but as I'm sure you're aware, this is actually our final Zoom meeting for the course. So we're going to walk you through week 6 and week 7 in Moodle so we can finish out with our final exam. And then we'll also talk for just a little bit about some additional information about reform programs and plans and the things that we know actually work. So let me do some screen sharing real quick and get you here on Moodle with me. Sorry, this is strange. There we go. Okay, so hopefully you can see everything over here. So we only have 2 more weeks left in the course. I just want to remind everybody that assignments, all assignments, including the final exam, are due on Saturday, December the 14th by 11:30 p.m. Central Standard Time. You know, normally each week's module ends on a Sunday, but because we have to, as instructors and professors, we have to have time to go in and enter grades and stuff like that. Everything's going to end on the 14th, which is a Saturday. So just plan accordingly. So in this particular week, in week 6, we're going to do the, I'm so sorry, I just feel flustered. I had to run across campus. Anyway, you have a reflective essay response to do, as well as part 1 of your final exam. So let's look real quickly first at the reflective essay response that's going to be due this week. And you know, basically you're just going to do a response to these 4 questions. So pretty simple: 4 things I've learned, 3 things I will use immediately, 2 things I'll use in the future, and then the 1 thing that you may still have a question about that you want me to clear up before we end the course. So like I said, pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Ideally, if you can do that and get it in by Sunday, December 8th, that'd be great, but I won't penalize you if it doesn't come in until the 14th. So let me just back out of this and let's talk about the final exam. Okay, now I've said it once, but I'm going to say it again. The final exam is due on Saturday, December the 14th. So what you're going to do is you're going to create a mini action plan based on the data and stuff that you hopefully were able to gather back in week 2. So let's look for just a second. If you can't or weren't able to find some data, just let me know and I can send you some that you can use. So let me pull this up here. Hang on. Let me stop sharing this screen so I can actually share the screen. I need to now. Here we go. Okay. Hopefully y'all can see this. Let me move it over. Okay, so this is, like I said, an abbreviated action plan that we want you to do. So what I want you to think about is either the school you're in or the school or district or parish you've got the data from, and you're going to create this plan. So pretty simple, you know, cover page, whatever, make sure you put your name on it. And then it's very simple. So CEO, it may be the principal, the headmaster, whatever. You can just put their title or you can put an actual name, whatever you want to do. Now, obviously, I don't know whether you made that name up or not, but for this purpose, it really doesn't matter. Who might be some other leaders? Again, you can list positions or titles, or you can list actual names. And then key support staff. So what is your objective going to be for this particular school? So let's assume that you are writing a reform plan to transform a school that has been, you know, really struggling. So your objective might be to improve student achievement scores in 4 major content areas: math, science, reading, social studies, by 10%, as tested on the state level test or assessment. Okay, so that would be your objective. Tell us about the current state of the school. So again, if it's a place that you actually work, you know, that should be pretty simple. If you're using a place where you don't actually work, gather what you can from the data. So this would include things like You know, our goal is to improve our graduation rate. We focus and spend a lot of time on literacy and numeracy, those kinds of things. Then again, going back to that data, you're going to list the demographics of the school. So pretty simple. You know, I'll base it on one of my high school principalships. So we had 2,963 students. It was almost exactly 1/3 white, 1/3 African American, 1/3 Hispanic. We had a 45, it varied actually, 45 to 60% poverty rate. Those are the kinds of things that I would be putting in there. Needs assessment, again, this is where you can go into more detail and list out some of those data points that you found in week 2 and explain a little bit about them. So, you know, tell me what are the strengths based on the data of the school, what are the weaknesses or opportunities for growth. So I know for us, when I was, you know, at the high school level, we really struggled the most with our writing for our second language learner students. So that was definitely an area that we needed to work on. So that would be one of my opportunities for growth. We did great in English and mathematics. So, you know, those were definitely strengths. So goals and expected outcomes. So just, you don't have to list a bunch. You know, I'm thinking 3 to 5 is sufficient. And remember to make sure that your goals are listed in such a way that they're specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and that there's a timeline attached to it. Okay, so the call of action, what are some actions that you might take to really push this goal forward? So I've given you a couple of examples that might help you with this. But again, it's going to be what are those main areas you're focusing on and how you're going to go about doing it. Okay, so let's look now at page 3. So what is the pull-through offer? What that means is what are specific tactics or strategies that you're going to use to keep the school on track. So, you know, how are you going to do that and keep them actively engaged in the work? So that could be something like that you're going to do weekly monitoring, or you're going to do pulse checks every 2 weeks and publish that in the school newsletter. Lots of different ways that you can do that. In terms of the process, you're going to tell us about what professional development is needed. So I know when we were working on this sort of stuff, when I was a principal, one of the things we realized was a lot of teachers really didn't understand developmentally where adolescents were. So part of our professional development became not only working with students from impoverished backgrounds, guiding second language learners, but we also did some work on the teenage brain so that everybody could better understand what it was that was going on physically and all of that with our students. Mentoring. So if you need some help, you know, who may be a mentor for you? Is it somebody from the Chamber of Commerce? Is it your supervisor? Is it another team member? It can be anybody you want. Relationships. So how are you going to ensure that there's positive relationships? And we're going to talk a little bit more about how critical those are tonight. But, you know, give me 1 to 3 things you're going to do to ensure that there's that positive student and teacher relationship. So I know one of the pieces that we worked on was we used the Capturing Kids' Heart model and professional development to really kind of talk about and help teachers to understand and learn how to really build trust, both from an organizational and relational standpoint. Leadership. You know, again, how are you going to communicate? Communication is probably one of the most critical but overlooked elements for schools. So, you know, it can be something like I'm going to publish a weekly newsletter. I'm going to host monthly coffees with the principal. And, you know, I'm going to have a leadership team that, you know, is responsible for going to community churches and giving updates once a month, that kind of stuff. Again, tell us what resources you might need to do this. And then, of course, the planning. So pretty simple here. Now, you don't have to list a ton of stuff. Like I said, I'm not asking you to write a dissertation, but give me enough information that we can kind of see where you're going. So these might be the 3 most critical actions that you need to do. So I've given you an example. One of those might be to plan professional development. Another might be to determine the school-based instructional strategies that are going to be uniformly implemented. But like I said, you only have to come up with 3. Budget. So again, I'm not asking for a ton here, but just give me an idea of what you might need some money to do. So for example, I mentioned capturing kids' hearts. Well, there's a cost to that program and that professional development. So if I decide that's one of the things I want to use, I'm going to list what that cost might be. You can look up costs for things on the internet, or you can also ballpark it. Again, I'm not going to be cross-referencing that. That's not the critical piece. I want you to think through, though, how budget and activities or strategies need to be aligned and tied together. Oftentimes I've seen principals write plans like this and they don't understand how critical the budget is, so they end up not being able to do things that are in their plan because they simply did not plan for the monetary needs. So very important. Over on page 4, you're also going to talk about norms and expectations. So, what are some norms? Like, for example, that what we say here stays here, what we learn, we take out to others. It might be that everyone is treated with respect and all ideas are valued. And again, you don't have to list a ton of them, but 2 to 3 is about right. Okay. Instructional strategies. So again, I'm not looking for a bunch. 3 to 5 is kind of the target range. So what are some of those critical teaching and learning strategies that you feel like absolutely need to be done for this to be successful? So I've given you an example of KWL charts. You could also put in here cooperative learning. You could put peer tutoring. Like I said, there's a lot of different instructional strategies. And if you don't know some good ones, then, just go to a Google search and type in Robert Marzano, Marzano, and put in instructional strategies. He's sort of the guru, and you'll get some good ones. And then finally, the summative pieces. How are you going to know if this was effective or not? Is it going to be that you're going to do a data analysis or a data comparison from your bench line or starting data to your summative data? So for example, if I'm going to use my state assessment data, my benchmark or my starting point is whatever the results are currently, and then I'm going to compare those to the results when we get them in May or June, and we're looking to make sure that we had a 10% growth rate. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about the evaluation. So there is a little bit extra space here, but like I said, try to stay kind of, brevity is better. When we have really tons and tons of detail, quite frankly, plans like this don't work when you do that because it's too much for people to absorb. So this is really getting you to look at very, very specific elements and to pull it into those that are going to be the most impactful and the most effective. So like I said, you can get started on this whenever you're ready, but it will be due on December the 14th. Okay, so let me stop sharing. Okay, do you guys have any questions about any of those kind of things? Are we all good? Okay, Emily, I see that you weren't working. Are you okay? Okay, well, let me pull this down. And let me move over to the presentation for tonight. And we'll kind of walk through it. So let me get it over here where you guys can see it. Okay, whoops, what did I just do? Sorry about that. I forgot I have to share before I can do that, otherwise it takes the screen out. There we go. Okay, so we're back to sharing again. And sorry, I'm just pulling some things down here. Let me go ahead and get this started from the beginning. Okay, so tonight what I want to spend some time talking to you about is really, hopefully, tying together what we've been learning and what we've been discussing. So, the whole idea behind urban educational reform is to really do everything that we can to improve outcomes for our youth of color, students who are living in impoverished situations, etc. And I think we've said many times there is no magic bullet, that can do this. It really has to do a lot with the right group of people coming together with dedication and intentionality and purpose to improve outcomes. So I love this quote. You don't build a top school, you build top teachers, and then the top teachers build the school. I've looked at a lot of different reform models, and really done some study around them. And, I'm always reminded, quite frankly, that at the end of the day, there's not a specific model or a program that I can go purchase or anything like that that's going to make a difference. It comes down to the most critical piece is the teachers that are in that school. Leadership also matters significantly. You have to have a principal or administrative leaders that are really committed to doing what it takes to ensure success for our students. And that's what we're going to focus on specifically tonight. So, the Brookings Institute came out in October, so this is pretty recent. And they've said that, when we look at urban ed, a lot of people want to define it by race or ethnicity, maybe location or physical dimensions, those kind of things. Well, in reality, we know that urban education means working with students who come from poverty. Oftentimes they'll have language barriers, and they lack the same kinds of opportunities as our students who are not impoverished have had growing up and being part of a community. Lots of people make mistakes, or make excuses for why our students are not doing well in our urban schools, and oftentimes what I hear is, well, it's the parents. They don't have parental support. They don't have access to reading materials, and we do know that there is a strong correlation between high poverty rates and low achievement. And we've used that as an excuse, quite frankly, for a long time, that there's a language barrier or whatever. I think we have to come to the realization that as educators, we can no longer use those as excuses. We really have to tackle this problem head on. And the good news is there are places that it's working, and we need to look at what they're doing that makes it work, as well as really understanding. So, the other thing that is starting to kind of come to the forefront is the fact that a lot of people finally have come to agree that urban schools need a major overhaul. There's some dangers with that mindset. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but like I said, it's a pretty, I think the good news is that a lot of people really are starting to see this and dedicate themselves to the improvement of our schools. So I've given you guys tons of data, but just to remind us, this is pretty recent data that currently 24% of all school-age children in public schools attend an urban school. 35% of the poor students in the United States are also in our urban schools, as are 43% of all minority students. And I guess the ones that really just hurt my heart is the fact that most fourth graders in an urban school cannot read and understand a simple children's book. This would be a book we would expect a first grader to be able to read. And unfortunately, our fourth graders can't even do it in some of our urban schools. Eighth graders can't solve a basic practical math problem, which again is very, very concerning. Half of our urban youth won't graduate high school in the normal 4-year span. And even those that do make it and get their high school diploma are really ill prepared for higher education or the workplace. I'm teaching for the first time this semester a freshman seminar class here at LSUS. And, I was one of those educators who got pretty tired of when I was in K-12 education or pre-K-12. Hearing from the colleges that students weren't prepared, when I knew we were doing everything we knew how to do to try to get our students so they could succeed in college. Unfortunately, I've seen now firsthand from the other side. I'm still somewhat shocked by how poor the students' writing skills are. that they don't have strong time management. They don't necessarily adhere to deadlines. And I do have a lot of students who would be considered impoverished or, something like that in my class. So instead of doing some of the stuff we would normally do in freshman seminar, we've been working on writing, we've been working on math, we've been working on time management. So hopefully we can get these students to where they not only have that high school diploma, but they also have a college degree. So it is, like I said, I've seen it in the research and it certainly is supported there, but I've also seen it firsthand now as an instructor working with undergrad students. I'm not going to read all this to you, but some kind of astounding things. Just the fact, even if you're not necessarily a student who's struggling, just the fact that you go to an urban school means that you're going to have lower performance just by the fact that you're in that type of school setting, which, I think doesn't bode very well. The other thing that I think is sort of shocking is that we can take students who have the same economic background and the same challenges, and we can put one in a public school and one in a Catholic private school, both in the urban environment. But the students in the Catholic school are going to way outperform our students in public school. So again,
Excuse me,
what is
Dr.
it?
Johnson.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm sorry, this is Kirsten.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask a question.
Sure.
Because you brought up a very good point about freshmen not being prepared for college.
Mm-hmm.
So excuse the noise in the background.
That's okay. Hang on. Let me just hang my phone up too.
Okay.
Okay. Sorry.
But I was curious so in the public school setting, do they have like a study skills course that the students can participate in order to better prepare them for college? Or do you primarily find that in a private school setting?
Yeah, hang on. Sorry, this person's persistent. Let me just tell them I'm teaching.
That's
Hello,
okay.
it's Tracy Johnson. I'm sorry, I'm teaching a class right now. Can you just call back tomorrow, please?
Yes, sure.
All right, thank you. Okay, sorry about that. Unfortunately, no, most schools do not. There are some programs out there that have proven to be really strong and helpful. AVID is one that comes to mind. But what I think we see too often, particularly in our urban schools, is we think that if we give students more of the same stuff, that's going to cure the problem. So, it's not uncommon to see students having to take a remedial math course alongside their algebra course, or even in the lower grades that, we're going to cut out social studies and science so we can spend 3 hours on reading. And the data just doesn't bear out that that's helpful. There are other skills that we can teach our students that would give us more gains. Like I said, I was kind of shocked when, because I'm a huge proponent of AVID. And so, I asked my students if they knew what Cornell note-taking was. And my students who come from a more affluent environment, and maybe some of our really strong suburban schools, they were all like, oh yeah, we were taught how to do that. My urban students had no clue what I was talking about. So, and unfortunately, like I said, I think that, people's good intentions, are to make sure that we get the kids where they need to be in reading, writing, and math. And they sometimes forget that those soft skills can also be absolutely critical to a student's success.
Thank you.
You're welcome, of course. Yeah, and you guys just jump in, please interrupt me because I get on a roll. Let's talk about NAEP. I have my own issues with standardized testing and things like that, but at this point, this is one of the accountability pieces that is used to compare our students. And so, again, these are very recent. These just came out. These are based on the 2019 NAEP scores that were from tests administered in the spring. 63% of our fourth graders in our non-urban schools are able to read at the basic level, whereas only 43% of students in the urban schools. So there's a 20-point difference there. If you're in a high school that has not only urban characteristics, but is also very high poverty, only 23% of our fourth graders can meet the minimum standard. So it's just, again, there's just this huge gap that seems to, no matter which way you look at it, or what data point that you're pulling in, we just seem to see this gap growing and growing and growing. We're creating generations of students who just aren't going to be able to make it, I guess is the best way to put it in the real world. We also know, too, that part of what contributes to these issues in our urban schools is that you will see areas that are very densely populated with poverty, and a lot of those other sort of social ills, I guess is the best way to put it. I remember in Dallas, one of the schools that I worked with, they were in probably one of the highest poverty rates. I mean, I think there was maybe one kid in the school, truthfully, that wasn't considered, coming from poverty. It sat in a neighborhood where there were liquor stores literally right next door to the school, lots of vagrancy, high crime. It was this area that, like I said, it was just astounding how many problems there were in this relatively small geographic area. So they didn't have adequate housing, and like I said, just every possible challenge that you could think of, these kids experienced. And we were talking one time with the kids, and we were planning a trip to take them ice skating at the Galleria Mall in Dallas. And physically, geographically, these kids were less than 10 miles from that part of Dallas. Not a single child had ever ventured beyond their neighborhood. You would have thought that we were taking them, I don't know, to Africa on a safari. That's how exotic the idea of traveling 10 miles from where they lived to another part of town to experiencing something different. So I think we also forget that our students living in poverty don't have the same just experiences that, our own children would have, or children in more affluent areas. It's also pretty critical, I guess, or we need to realize too that, in some of our cities, more than almost half of the students are living in poverty. So I think we have to really wrap our heads around, if we're going to work in urban education and in our urban schools, that this is the one chance we have to change the trajectory for a child's life. And we really have to get it right. Schools are truly their only hope for a life and a way out of poverty. So really important for us to grasp the depth and complexity of these challenges and issues. Also, too, it's not uncommon to see school buildings that are in disrepair, where we have teachers who are not trained in the content they're teaching, they're not certified. They may be, the teachers may have very limited understanding or knowledge of what subjects they're teaching. And again, that's not the fault of the teacher. It's just unfortunately the conditions that we have allowed to perpetuate over time. Also, too, many urban schools are rife in bureaucracy, and I can tell you from experience, this is absolutely true. It's like every principle of effective management are not used in some of these big school districts or bureaucracies. I used to hear principals and things all the time complaining they didn't have enough money to do what they needed to do. And when you looked at the per pupil allocation that the district was getting, it was kind of hard to understand why schools were saying this until you looked at that trickle-down effect and how often money was spent on central office, quote, support, and it wasn't given to the schools. So I'm a huge proponent of zero-based budgeting and allowing schools to have access. So if your per pupil allocation is $10,000 and you have 100 students, then you should get $100,000 kind of thing, so that you can really meet the needs of your kids. But I will tell you in truth, bureaucracies seem to feed on themselves, and oftentimes they are the system is more interested in perpetuating the system than it is really about making change. Also, too, one of the things that it used to just make me furious, but I would say all the time that the management style for some of this bureaucracy was chaos, but it was chaos by design. And what I mean by that is every time you turned around, we're going to try this, we're going to try this, we're going to try this. And we didn't ever have the opportunity to really do continual transformation and get it right. You cannot change an entire system in a year or 6 months. It takes years. In fact, the minimum that I've seen it work well is 3 years, but the average is closer to 5 to 7. And so instead of, constantly saying, oh, we're going to run, this is our new reform plan, this is the reform plan, you really have to pick something and do it well and then stick to it. Also too, the average tenure for a superintendent in an urban school setting or system is 2.5 to 3 years. So every time you get a new superintendent, it's a revolving door. They're bringing in their system, they're bringing in their people. And so again, what suffers are, the schools, the people that are the boots on the ground working with our most needy students. So instead of allowing that bureaucracy to perpetuate itself, we have to put a stop to it. And I'll give you a good example. So when I worked for Dallas ISD for 20 years. Then I left and went to Irving ISD in Texas for 8 years. And then I ended up going back to Dallas by choice. When I was in Dallas, we had that revolving door of superintendents. We had one who went to prison. I mean, it was just a mess. And every 2 to 3 years, we're getting a new superintendent. And the schools were in horrible, horrible shape. The school where I was principal was in such bad shape that we had black mold literally growing on the walls. I mean, you could see it. And we could not seem to get anybody to listen, to come, to fix these problems, etc. So I was recruited to go to Irving and to be a high school principal there. And I'll never forget, so my best friend and I, she was also a principal in Dallas, so we both came from the same type of environment. So we drive over from Dallas to Irving to look at the new school where I was going to be principal. And as we drove in the parking lot, the first thing she said to me was, oh, wow, this must be a rich school. And I'm looking at her, I said, what do you mean? Because I knew the demographics, I knew the stats. And she said, you've got tennis courts. She said, do we have tennis? Do we have golf? Do we have any of those things? And I said, no, you're right. What her point was, and which ended up being true, was at the time in Irving, they had such a great superintendent who really understood that we needed to put all of our resources into our kids and have as little central office as we could to survive. And what a huge difference. I walked from this school where, like I said, black mold is literally growing down the walls. I mean, the walls in some places were completely black with mold. And that's just the tip of the iceberg with the building and facility problems. Let alone we didn't have a softball field, we didn't have tennis, we didn't have golf, we didn't have much of anything. I think the band uniforms were probably 30 years old. That's how bad things were. I went to another district, which is also urban and demographically very similar to the school I left. The difference was they poured their money back into the schools. And so the schools were beautiful. They were clean. They were well maintained. They made sure that the kids had everything they possibly needed. And so it was just that mindset of we're not going to let the bureaucracy drive this boat. We're going to let the needs of our students drive it. So it's rare to find that in urban schools, but I tell you from experience, it makes a huge, huge difference. So, lots of reasons that we need to challenge this. People have tried things. So, we've had state takeovers. We've had hiring non-educators to come in and run it. We shut down schools and reconstituted them. We've tried all of these things. Some of them have worked, some of them haven't. Because at the end of the day, guys, it's all about the principal and campus leadership and the teachers in the building. So, also, too, one of the things that, particularly in urban systems, seems to be a big focus is people being compliant. Well, I've always had a little bit of a rebel spirit. And so as a principal, I used to say all the time, compliance does not equal excellence. Just because I can check off the box that I did what you told me to doesn't mean it's going to improve my students' performance. And so at the end of the day, you got to trust me. You hired me to lead this place. And if I screw it up, fire me or I'll resign, to really do what's best for kids. And that oftentimes meant thinking outside the box or not following the district's curriculum or whatever it was that they were telling me to do. And thankfully I was able to work for some people who I said, look, I'm about the results. You want results. I'll deliver the results, but you got to give me the freedom and latitude to get what there the way that I think is best based on the kids and the needs of my kids and with my faculty. They know this better than anybody. And when I had that opportunity to do that, we went from a low-performing school. In 2 years, we were a National Blue Ribbon School of Excellence. We were named the best school in the United States by the Intel Foundation. We had the top rating, in the entire state. Amazing things can happen, but unfortunately, systems tend to perpetuate themselves. So a lot of central office leaders or supervisors of schools and principals focus on compliance. And I'm telling you, so what if I turned my report in on time? Who cares? What does it have to do with improving student achievement? So, not to depress you, there are places that you can have that kind of freedom, and as long as you deliver the results. But we also have to understand, as you guys think about moving into those really exciting new leadership roles in the future, that when you're the superintendent, really think up hard and long about what you're asking schools to do and how you're expecting them to get there. So these are some ideas that have actually been proven out in the research. We can debate all day about charter schools and vouchers. That's really not the point. But one of the things they've noticed that when charter schools start popping up in our urban areas, it has pushed the school systems to do things differently and to really look more at effectiveness. Again, I'll give you our example in Dallas. We had a huge rise in charter schools, and the school district as a result was losing student population. We were losing between 2,000 and 5,000 students every year from our normal enrollment rates. And so the district finally said, okay, we got to do something about this. So we created schools of choice, magnet schools. We had a lot of different options that parents and students can choose from because we realized we needed to be competitive. Would we have done that without the charter schools and the loss of population? Probably not. So like I said, whether you think they're the greatest thing ever or you think they're, pure evil, that's beside the point. They do have an impact and will sometimes spur that competition we need to happen. So we know that there are certain things that we have to do. So this is basically the plan, for what we need to do. And I'm not going to read all this to you, but you can see we have to have high standards. We have to know what it is we're supposed to do for academics. We must share our results, whether we like it or not, even if they're bad. We've got to share them. And so we have to use that information to define what it is we expect our kids to do. And that for our districts that need resources for capital improvement, you have to just be really creative and find a way to make that happen. I know in Dallas, one of the things we did was we had the first true public-private partnership. We wanted to build a new school in an area, and we had some bond money, but it wasn't quite enough. And so thankfully, we went out in the community and we had some donors who really stepped in. So the total price tag of the school was close to $50 million. $33 million was donated by private individuals. And man, we named everything. If you donated $10 million, which we had 2 people do, you got a whole huge section of the school named after you. But again, it required us to really get creative to be able to pull in the funds we needed to make these things happen. Also, too, I've said this before, and this was probably one of my biggest challenges as an assistant superintendent is, the people above me, the chief of schools, she really wanted to control staffing and resources. And, so there was not a lot of flexibility. I really had to fight with her to allow principals to decide, here's your staff. There's, pick a number, there's 100. You allocate them and use them however you need to, as opposed to central office telling them, you must have a principal, you must have 3 assistant principals, you must have a discipline clerk, etc. But to really give the leader of that campus some flexibility. We also have to make sure that we see ourselves now in a competitive environment because we're fighting for students. So if we build quality programs and we have those great caring staffs, our students will come to us. We don't have to fight for them. So Union City, New Jersey, if you want to do a good Google search, they have a really strong urban school system. In fact, one of the things that I was really impressed with, they have a graduation rate of 90%, and then 75% of their graduates actually went to college, which is outstanding. So their third graders scores, as all the way through high school, are at the statewide average. So, it takes a lot of work, but this is a great model that you can look at and emulate, okay? And so, I just love this sort of idea that came out of there, that there's not a miracle cure, but it's continuous improvement over many years. A lot of urban school systems move principals around all the time. I know in Dallas, when I first started in the principalship, if you were effective, you got moved every 2 to 3 years. It's like go in and fix a school, and then you fixed it, and then you go in and you fix another school. Well, thankfully, they finally realized that that's really not very helpful. It doesn't lead to long-term sustained success. So you have to give people time in a place to really establish that culture and climate, as well as those best practices if you want there to be sustainability of improvement. So basically, here's what it boils down to. How do we know what is it that works to make urban schools successful? And again, I'm not going to read this to you. Hopefully you'll take the time to go through it. But some key points are, there has to be collaboration. There has to be trust, both from an organizational standpoint and a relational standpoint between leadership and teachers. There has to be a system set up to help new teachers. I know for many of us, 1,000 years ago when the dinosaurs roamed the earth and I started teaching, you were thrown into your classroom and wished good luck, and that's the last time anybody ever helped you again. We cannot allow that to happen. There has to be modeling, there has to be sharing and swapping of good ideas, and that we have to constantly be supporting each other, whether you're a first-year teacher or you're the seasoned vet, who's sort of, been there for a long time. We have to share and share and share some more. We also have to make sure that the culture is really based in love and caring. Relationships matter for all students in all schools with their teachers and leaders, but it's even more critically important in an urban school setting. And it's not just the student to adult relationship, it's the teacher to the parents, the principal to the community, the student to the principal, etc. And so we have to really do that. I hope nobody's a Teach for America person, but quite honestly, they're not very successful in our urban schools because they come in with the mindset they're going to save the world, and they stay 2 years, and then they go back out and either go to a suburb if they stay in teaching, or they go into corporate America. That's not what we need. Studies actually show that people who are from that neighborhood or a second or third tier, quote, college do better in our urban schools than people who have gone a different route, because they tend to destabilize the school when we're looking for people that are there with an abundance of passion. So, schools that are successful in urban settings run on loyalty and longevity. Districts support and create time for teachers to work together. So I know one of the things I did as a high school principal in our master schedule, we built in an extra planning period. So instead of teachers teaching 6 out of 7 with 1 period off for planning, they taught 5 of 7 and had 2 periods. One of those periods was collaborative. They had to be working with their team. And then I know a couple of years after we had done that, we were like, oh, we're doing well, maybe we can take this out. My teacher's like, no, you cannot take this out, because that collaboration became part and parcel of who we were. And what we were doing. So again, you have to honor that teachers need time to think, plan, reflect, talk, collaborate. We can't expect them to do it only before school and after school. We also know too that our students are coming from a little bit, not a little bit, but they come without a strong vocabulary or experience with literacy and numeracy and all that. So again, we have to immerse our students in language from K on. We also have to make sure too that we want our students to really understand conceptually what they need, what they're learning, as opposed to rote memorization. We also know that we have to teach values. You know, a lot of people would disagree with me on that, but the research bears out that we have to weave value teaching into our lessons. So, you know, just spend some time thinking about value-based questions, you know, things like, what moral lesson did you learn? You know, what are the moral messages behind this story? We also have to know too that we cannot script instruction and have sustainable achievement when we do that, because the master teacher absolutely changes what they're doing pretty frequently based on what's happening in the classroom. Okay, so the good, bad, the ugly. Again, this sort of the 10 top things that need to happen, you know, if you're working in an urban school. So, you know, understand what you can and should change, model what you expect, and that's to everybody in the community. Be willing to be a learner and constantly learn more and more and more. Be a part of the community. So, you know, go to their events, be a part of that. Use the 90-10 communication rule. That means 90% of the time you're listening and only 10% are you actually talking. Also, understand too that just because it works in school A doesn't mean it will work in school B, because there's not a one-size-fits-all. Seek autonomy so that you can have the flexibility to do some things you need to. Ask for feedback from everyone. I will tell you, my campus leadership team, we had our teachers evaluate us every single month. And it was just a series of questions. They were done anonymously, and I'll tell you, it really helped us to grow, but it also showed the teachers we were willing to be vulnerable and listen to their feedback. Always be painfully honest, even if it's not what people want to hear, and don't forget, like I said, in urban schools, relationship building, relationship building, relationship building. Okay, so let me get out of this and stop sharing. So in our last couple minutes here, do you guys have any questions or anything like that?
I have a question, Doctor. Well, I have a statement. I don't know if it'll turn into a question.
No, that's okay. Go
But
ahead.
earlier when you were talking about charter schools, I know that in New Orleans, there have been like several scandals or situations with charter schools where I know there was a particular situation.
Yeah.
Where,
hey, Kirsten. Yeah, Kirsten, sorry, you're breaking up.
Students who were not passing core classes
Right.
or hadn't taken a core class were in order to graduate. Oh, hold on. Okay, what about now?
Yeah, you're better. That's better. Thank you. Yeah, I heard most of it. Just kind of towards the end, you were fading out.
Okay, what about now?
Yeah, no, perfect. Now I can hear you.
Is this better?
Yes, ma'am. Go ahead.
Let's see.
Kirsten, I think I got the gist of what you're saying. Yeah, there have been some really horrible charter school systems that have done some things that are certainly immoral, possibly unethical, very likely illegal.
Yes.
And unfortunately, that can happen whether it's a charter school or a public school. You know, so I think there's a nice balance that has to happen between oversight as well as autonomy. So, you know, before we jump full force into charters as being, you know, the savior, which I don't believe that there's any one thing that is or can be a savior, I think we as a group of educators have to make sure that we have the best people in there, but there's also audit processes and all those kind of things. When there's
Okay.
not some level of oversight and accountability, then people tend to use those charters for their own personal gains. I know in Texas that there was a pretty big shakeup in a charter system there, where the only people employed by the charter schools were all related to, the superintendent. And they were
Right.
making these ridiculously high salaries, and they couldn't show that they were ever even actually working or doing anything with the students. So, like I said, I think there has to be a balance, and part of that's a legislative issue at the state level. Part of it's a community issue. But also, too, I think we have to empower ourselves as educators and as teachers to stand up and be willing to say, look, there's something wrong here. So that we're not wasting taxpayer money, but more importantly, we're not meeting the needs of our kids.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Sorry about the sound issue.
That's okay. Not a problem. Well, if you guys don't have anything else, I've really enjoyed, you guys have been the pioneers for our Urban Ed program. And we ended up with a really small class, which I'm not used to. I'm used to classes of more than 100. So this has been a really refreshing change. But, Urban Ed, I think, is really going to become the next, I hate to say this, but I guess the next big thing in education, because we are becoming more urbanized. And, good teaching is good teaching, but I think we also have to really recognize and appreciate the fact that there's some unique things that need to happen. So people like you guys that have some knowledge and experience are going to be in very high demand. Because it takes a special person to work in an urban environment and to thrive. And like I said, hopefully we've got more people like you coming on board with the passion. So I've thoroughly enjoyed getting to know you guys, and hopefully I'll see you. And I know I'm going to teach it. I'm not teaching in the spring, but I think my next set of classes come in the summer. So hopefully I'll get to see in some of those. But thank you guys. And if you ever need anything, just give me a shout. I'm here to help and support. So I'm going to end our meeting. Thank you guys. Y'all have a great night. Let me turn off